The moment the words left Dad's mouth, a tidal wave of shock hit me. "Just so you know, I decided today's the day. I'm selling the house." He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather, not dropping a bombshell that would shatter our lives. I stared at him, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. Beside me, my sister Arden gasped, her eyes wide. "What? Why?" Dad shrugged, sipping his coffee. "It's time. This old place is too big for just the three of us. Besides, the money from the sale will fund our travel plans, Arden. Remember those dreams we talked about?" Arden's face lit up, a grin spreading across her features. But I couldn't share her enthusiasm. All I could think about was how this decision would ruin everything I'd been working towards. "You can't do this," I said, my voice tight. "This is our home, Dad. It's been in the family for generations." He leveled a look at me. "Verity, I know change is hard, but it's my decision to make." Anger flared in my chest. Of course Arden was on board with this harebrained scheme. She was always the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in Dad's eyes. Meanwhile, I was the one who'd been holding everything together since Mom died, managing the family businesses, making sure the bills got paid. And this was the thanks I got? I pushed back my chair, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor. "I have to go. I have a meeting." Dad frowned. "On a Saturday?" "Some of us have responsibilities," I snapped. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with them, couldn't bear to see the excitement on Arden's face. I grabbed my purse and stormed out, slamming the front door behind me. As I walked to my car, my mind raced. I'd been counting on my inheritance, on the security of knowing the estate would always be there. Now, with a few careless words, Dad had ripped that away. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I couldn't let this happen. I wouldn't. Dad had no idea how much I needed that money. The divorce had left me with nothing, and my ex, Calvin, was still bitter about the settlement. He'd do anything to hurt me, to hurt my family. As I pulled out of the driveway, a plan began to form in my mind. Dad wanted to sell the house? Fine. But I'd make sure the money ended up where it belonged, with me. I'd forge the documents, redirect the funds. He'd never even know what hit him. A grim smile tugged at my lips. Arden might be Dad's favorite, but I was the smart one, the resourceful one, and I'd do whatever it took to protect what was mine, even if it meant betraying the only family I had left. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every time Arden brought up the sale or her travel plans, I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. How could she be so selfish? Didn't she understand what this meant for me? I tried to reason with Dad, to make him see how unfair this was. "I've been the one holding everything together," I argued. "I deserve a say in what happens to the estate." But he just shook his head. "Verity, I've made up my mind. The house is going on the market, and that's final." I could feel my control slipping. One evening, I cornered Arden in the kitchen. "Why do you get to dictate our lives just because you're the baby of the family?" I hissed. She blinked at me, confusion written all over her face. "What are you talking about? This isn't about me, Verity. It's about what Dad wants." "What Dad wants," I mimicked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You mean what you want. You've always been his favorite, and now you're manipulating him into giving you everything." Arden's eyes narrowed. "That's not true, and you know it. Stop being so dramatic." I laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Dramatic? I'll show you dramatic." I stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something, had to take back control. That's when I started putting my plan into action. It was almost too easy to forge Dad's signature on the financial documents, to set up a new account in my name, and start siphoning off funds. He was so trusting, so naive, he never even checked the statements. But Arden, with her suspicious nature, started noticing things. The way I could suddenly afford new clothes, expensive dinners out. She'd give me these sidelong glances, her brow furrowed like she was trying to piece together a puzzle. One day she confronted me. "Where are you getting all this money, Verity? You haven't worked in months." I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "I have my ways. Don't worry about it." She crossed her arms. "Is that why you've been so against selling the house? Because you're stealing from Dad?" I flinched. She was getting too close to the truth. "You don't know what you're talking about. I'm not stealing anything." Arden shook her head. I don't believe you, and I'm going to find out what you're up to. Panic clawed at my throat. I couldn't let her ruin everything, not when I was so close. I had to find a way to stop her, to throw her off the scent. That's when I thought of Calvin, my dear, vengeful ex-husband. He hated my family almost as much as he hated me. If anyone could help me take Arden down, it was him. I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed his number. "Calvin," I said when he answered. "I need your help. It's time to make my sister pay for everything she's done." I could practically hear his smirk through the line. "I thought you'd never ask. What did you have in mind?" As I outlined my scheme, I felt a thrill of anticipation. Arden thought she could outsmart me, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I would make her regret ever crossing me. And when the dust settled, I'd be the one left standing with everything I'd ever wanted. The house, the money, the power. It was all within my grasp, and I'd burn down the whole world to get it. With Calvin on board, my plan kicked into high gear. We met up at a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one would recognize us. Over cheap whiskey, we hammered out the details. "You're sure you can pull this off?" Calvin asked, his eyes glinting with malice. "Forging documents is one thing, but embezzling from your own father? That's a whole new level of messed up." I tossed back my drink, relishing the burn in my throat. "I'm not just going to pull it off. I'm going to make it look like Arden's the one behind it all." Calvin let out a low whistle. "You really hate your sister, don't you?" I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You have no idea." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the scheme. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, manipulating bank statements and transferring funds. It was almost too easy. Dad's accounts were linked to the estate, and with the impending sale, no one was paying close attention to the money coming in and going out. But as the numbers in my own account grew, so did Arden's suspicions. She started watching me like a hawk. Her eyes narrowed every time I stepped out for a meeting or came home with a new purchase. One evening, she cornered me in the living room. "I know what you're doing, Verity," she said, her voice low and accusing. "You're stealing from Dad, aren't you?" I scoffed, trying to play it off. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm just managing some investments for the estate. It's all above board." Arden wasn't buying it. "Then why are you being so secretive? Why won't you let me see the statements?" I felt a flare of anger. She had no right to question me, to stick her nose where it didn't belong. "Because it's none of your business, Arden. I'm the one who's been taking care of everything while you've been off chasing your silly little dreams." Her face flushed with indignation. "Those silly little dreams are what's going to give Dad a better life. But you don't care about that, do you? All you care about is yourself." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a hiss. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? The golden child who can do no wrong. Well, guess what? I'm done living in your shadow. I'm taking what's mine, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." Arden's eyes widened, and for a moment I saw a flicker of fear. Good. Let her be afraid. Let her see what I was capable of. She backed away, her hands raised in surrender. "I don't know what's gotten into you, Verity, but this isn't over. I'm going to find out the truth, and when I do, you'll be sorry." I watched her go, my heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and terror. She was getting too close, but I couldn't stop now. I was in too deep. That night, I met up with Calvin again. "We need to speed things up," I told him. "Arden's onto us." He frowned. "What do you want to do?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to say. "We need to set her up, make it look like she's the one who's been embezzling, plant evidence, frame her somehow." Calvin's eyes widened. "That's risky, Verity. If we get caught—" "We won't," I snapped. "I've come too far to let Arden ruin everything. We'll make it work." He sighed, but I could see the gleam of excitement in his eyes. He was just as twisted as I was, just as hungry for revenge. "All right," he said. "Let's do it. Let's take the little princess down." Dad's birthday was supposed to be a celebration, a chance for the family to come together and forget about the tension of the past few weeks. But as I watched Arden move around the room, her eyes constantly darting in my direction, I knew there would be no peace today. We were gathered in the living room, a small pile of presents on the coffee table. Dad was in his armchair, a smile on his face as he sipped his morning coffee. Arden perched on the edge of the couch, her body rigid with barely suppressed anger. I tried to act normal, forcing a smile as I handed Dad his gift. "Happy birthday, old man. This one's from me." He tore off the wrapping paper, revealing a sleek new watch. "Wow, Verity, this is too much. You shouldn't have." I shrugged. "Only the best for you, Dad." Arden made a small sound of disbelief, and I shot her a warning glare. She'd been snooping around my room earlier, and I'd caught her going through my desk. She was getting too close to the truth, and I needed to shut her down before she ruined everything. As Dad admired his new watch, Arden stood up abruptly. "Can I talk to you in private, Verity?" I hesitated, but there was no way to avoid it without looking suspicious. "Sure, let's go in the kitchen." She led the way, her steps quick and purposeful. As soon as we were out of earshot, she whirled on me. "I found the documents, Verity. The forged signatures, the fake accounts. You've been stealing from Dad, haven't you?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about, Arden. You're being paranoid." She laughed, the sound harsh and disbelieving. "Don't play dumb with me. I saw the transfers, the missing money. You think you've caught me in some kind of game, Verity? These are serious accusations." I stepped closer, my voice low and threatening. "You're right, they are serious accusations. Accusations that could ruin our family, tear us apart. Is that what you want?" Arden's eyes narrowed. "What I want is the truth. I want you to admit what you've done and face the consequences." I shook my head. "I haven't done anything wrong, Arden. And even if I had, do you really think Dad would believe you? He trusts me, relies on me. You're just the flighty little sister who's never had to worry about anything." Her face flushed with anger. "That's not true. I care about this family just as much as you do." "Then prove it," I hissed. "Keep your mouth shut and let me handle things. Don't go running to Dad with wild accusations." For a moment I thought she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped, and I saw the defeat in her eyes. "Fine, but this isn't over, Verity. I'm going to find a way to stop you." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Good luck with that, sis. You'll need it." We rejoined Dad in the living room, putting on a show of normality. But inside, my mind was racing. Arden was getting too close, and I needed to act fast. As soon as the birthday festivities were over, I called Calvin. "We need to move up the timeline," I told him. "Arden found the documents, and she's threatening to go to Dad." He swore under his breath. "I told you this was risky, Verity. What do you want to do?" I closed my eyes, steeling myself for what I knew had to be done. "We have to frame her. Make it look like she's the one who's been stealing. It's the only way to save ourselves." Calvin was silent for a moment. Then, "All right, I'll handle it. Just be ready to play your part when the time comes." I hung up, my hands shaking. I was crossing a line, one I could never come back from, but it was the only way to protect what was mine, and I would do anything to keep it that way. The fallout from Arden's discovery was swift and brutal. Dad, always the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over, but it was clear that the cracks in our family were turning into chasms. In a last-ditch effort to uncover the truth, he hired a private investigator. I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, before my carefully constructed web of lies unraveled. I was in my room, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Calvin standing there, a grim look on his face. "We have a problem," he said, pushing past me into the room. "The PI found the money trail. He knows about the embezzlement." I felt a rush of fear, but I pushed it down. "What about Arden? Did he find anything on her?" Calvin shook his head. "No, but that's not the worst part. He also found out about our connection. He knows we've been working together." I swore under my breath. This was bad. If Dad found out about my alliance with Calvin, he'd never forgive me. He'd always hated my ex-husband, thought he was a bad influence. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice shaking. Calvin's eyes glinted with a familiar ruthlessness. "We stick to the plan. We frame Arden, make it look like she's the mastermind behind it all. It's the only way to save ourselves." I hesitated. Framing Arden was one thing, but doing it with Calvin by my side, it felt wrong, like a betrayal of the worst kind. But then I thought about everything I stood to lose. The money, the power, the security. I couldn't let it all slip away, not after everything I'd done to get it. "Okay," I said finally. "We'll do it your way. But we have to be careful. If anyone finds out the truth..." Calvin grabbed my shoulders, his grip almost painful. They won't. We're too smart for that. We'll make them all pay for underestimating us. There was a knock at the door, and we sprang apart. I smoothed my hair, trying to look calm as I opened it. It was Dad, his face grave. Verity, we need to talk. The investigator found something. My heart hammered in my chest, but I forced a smile. Of course, Dad. Let's go downstairs. As we walked into the living room, I saw Arden sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. The investigator stood by the window, a file folder in his hands. What's going on? I asked, trying to sound innocent. Dad sighed. The investigator found evidence of embezzlement, Verity. Large sums of money transferred out of the estate accounts. I feigned shock. What? That's impossible. Who would do something like that? The investigator cleared his throat. The transfers were made using your sister's login credentials. It appears that Arden has been stealing from the family. Arden leapt to her feet, her eyes blazing. That's a lie! I would never do that! Dad held up a hand. The evidence is clear, Arden. I didn't want to believe it, but I can't ignore the facts. I watched as Arden crumbled, tears streaming down her face. A part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, seeing her brought low. But another part, buried deep, felt a pang of guilt. Dad turned to me, his eyes searching. Did you know about this, Verity? Is that why you've been so resistant to selling the house? I shook my head. No, Dad. I had no idea. I'm just as shocked as you are. It was a lie, but it rolled off my tongue with ease. I'd gotten good at lying, at manipulating the truth to suit my needs. As Arden sobbed and Dad comforted her, I caught Calvin's eye across the room. He gave me a small nod, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. We'd done it. We'd won. But as I stood there, watching my family fall apart, I couldn't help but wonder at what cost. The revelation of Arden's supposed betrayal sent shockwaves through the family. Dad was beside himself, torn between anger and disbelief. Arden, for her part, couldn't stop crying, insisting over and over that she was innocent. As for me, I played the role of the shocked and devastated sister to perfection. Inside, though, I was a mess of conflicting emotions. Triumph, guilt, fear, they all swirled together in a sickening cocktail. A few days later, Dad called a family meeting. He said we needed to discuss the situation, to decide how to move forward. I knew it was just an excuse to confront Arden, to make her face the consequences of her actions. We gathered in the living room, the same room where we'd celebrated so many birthdays and holidays. But there was no joy in the air now, only a suffocating tension. Dad sat in his armchair, his face grave. Arden perched on the edge of the couch, her eyes red and puffy. I took a seat across from her, trying to look as neutral as possible. How could you do this to your own father, your sister? Dad asked, his voice thick with emotion. How could you betray us like this? Arden shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't, Dad. I swear to you, I didn't do anything wrong. Dad slammed his hand down on the arm of the chair, making us both jump. Don't lie to me, Arden. The evidence is clear. You stole from me, from this family. I watched as Arden crumpled under the weight of his anger. She looked so small, so broken. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything she had, everything I'd never been given. The love, the attention, the adoration. She'd had it all, and she'd squandered it. She deserved this. I'm sorry, Dad, I said, my voice trembling with fake emotion. I should have seen the signs. I should have stopped her. Dad turned to me, his eyes softening. It's not your fault. Verity. Arden made her choices. She has to face the consequences. Arden let out a choked sob. Please, Dad, you have to believe me. I didn't do this. Someone is setting me up. I scoffed. Who would want to set you up, Arden? Who would go to all that trouble? She looked at me then, really looked at me. And in that moment, I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew I was behind it all, but it was too late. Dad was already convinced of her guilt, already planning his next moves. I'm sorry, Arden, but I can't let this go, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I'm going to have to involve the authorities. You need help, and you need to face the legal repercussions of your actions. Arden buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I watched her, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction. I'd won. I'd finally beaten her at her own game. But as I sat there, basking in my victory, I couldn't shake the nagging sense of unease. The way Arden had looked at me, the accusation in her eyes, she knew the truth, and she wouldn't rest until she'd exposed me. I'd have to be careful, have to cover my tracks even more carefully than before. I couldn't let her ruin everything, not when I was so close to getting what I wanted. As Dad comforted Arden, murmuring empty promises of support and forgiveness, I slipped out of the room. I had work to do, plans to make. The game wasn't over yet, and I was determined to come out on top, no matter what it took. The final nail in Arden's coffin came a week later, at a family dinner that will forever be etched in my memory. Dad had invited the private investigator to join us, saying he had new information to share. I was on edge, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I'd been working with Calvin to cover our tracks, to make sure nothing could be traced back to us, but the paranoia was eating me alive, making me jump at every shadow. We sat around the dining room table, picking at our food in tense silence. Arden was barely holding it together, her face pale and drawn. Dad just looked tired, like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Finally, the investigator cleared his throat. "I've uncovered new evidence in the case," he said, his voice grave. "It appears that Arden was not acting alone in her embezzlement scheme." My heart stopped. For a moment, I was sure he was talking about me, that somehow he'd discovered my involvement. But then he slid a folder across the table, and I saw the name on the cover. Calvin Mitchell. Dad's face went white. Calvin, Verity's ex-husband? What does he have to do with this? The investigator opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. It appears that Calvin and Arden have been working together for months, siphoning money out of the estate accounts. We've found evidence of their communication, their plans to frame Verity for the theft. I sat there, stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Calvin had betrayed me, had been working with Arden all along. Arden was crying now, big, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. "It's not true," she wailed. "I didn't do anything wrong. Calvin is lying." Dad shook his head, his face a mask of disappointment. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Arden. The evidence is overwhelming." He turned to the investigator. "What happens now? Will they face charges?" The investigator nodded. "I've already turned everything over to the authorities. They'll be issuing arrest warrants for both Arden and Calvin." I felt a rush of relief, followed quickly by a pang of guilt. I'd wanted to take Arden down, but not like this. Not with Calvin's betrayal. Dad turned to me, his eyes searching. "Did you know about this, Verity? Did you have any idea what they were planning?" I shook my head, the lie bitter on my tongue. "No, Dad. I had no idea. I'm just as shocked as you are." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I just don't understand how it got this far, how I could have been so blind." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "It's not your fault, Dad. They fooled us all." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. I was the biggest fool of all, thinking I could trust Calvin, thinking I could outsmart everyone. As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a rising panic. What if Calvin turned on me, tried to implicate me in the scheme? What if Arden found a way to prove her innocence? I excused myself from the table, mumbling something about needing air. I stumbled outside, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I had to do something, had to find a way to protect myself. But as I stood there, staring out into the gathering darkness, I realized the truth. There was no way out. No escape from the tangled web I'd woven. I'd destroyed my family, my life, all in the pursuit of money and power. And now I would have to face the consequences, just like Arden and Calvin, just like the monster I'd become. I sank to my knees, a sob tearing from my throat. I'd won, but at what cost? What was left for me now, in the ruins of everything I'd once held dear? I didn't know. And for the first time in my life, I was truly, utterly lost. The aftermath of the dinner was a blur. Arden and Calvin were arrested, charged with fraud and embezzlement. The courts moved quickly, eager to make an example of them. I watched from the sidelines, numb to the chaos around me. I should have been happy, should have been celebrating my victory. But all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest, a sense of loss so profound it took my breath away. Dad was a wreck, barely able to function. He couldn't understand how his own daughter could have betrayed him so deeply. He turned to me for support, leaning on me in a way he never had before. I played the role of the dutiful daughter, the rock in the storm. But inside I was screaming, suffocating under the weight of my own guilt. The day of the trial arrived, and I forced myself to go, to sit in the courtroom and watch as Arden and Calvin's fate was decided. They both looked so small, so broken. Even Calvin, with his arrogant smirk, seemed diminished somehow. The evidence was damning, the case clear-cut. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict. Guilty, on all counts. I watched as Arden crumpled, her sobs echoing through the courtroom. Calvin just sat there, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. The judge was merciless, handing down the maximum sentence for both of them. 20 years in prison, no chance of parole. As the bailiff led them away, Arden turned to look at me, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You did this," she hissed. "You set me up. I know it was you." I just stared at her, my face a mask of indifference, but inside I was reeling, her words hitting me like a physical blow. She knew. She had always known, and now she would spend the rest of her life paying for my sins. I left the courtroom in a daze, my mind spinning. I had won, but at what cost? My family was in shambles, my sister's life ruined, and for what? Money? Power? It all seemed so meaningless now. Dad found me outside, his face lined with grief. "I never thought I'd see the day," he said, his voice hoarse. "My own child, a criminal." I swallowed hard, trying to find the words. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I can't imagine how hard this must be for you." He looked at me, his eyes searching. "You're all I have left now, Verity. Promise me you'll never do anything like this. Promise me you'll be better than they were." I nodded, my throat tight. "I promise, Dad. I'll make you proud." But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. I was no better than Arden or Calvin. I was worse, because I had manipulated them all, had destroyed everything in my path. And now, I would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. The months passed, and life went on. Dad and I tried to pick up the pieces, to rebuild what we could. But the wounds were deep, the scars permanent. I threw myself into my work, into managing the estate. I told myself it was for Dad, to make things easier for him. But the truth was, I needed the distraction, needed something to keep the guilt at bay. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Dad turned to me, his face somber. "It's time we look forward, Arden. Let's make new memories, just us, truly free of the past." I nodded, trying to smile, but inside I knew the truth. I would never be free of the past, never be able to escape the choices I had made. I had won, but I had lost everything that mattered. And now I would have to live with that bitter truth every day for the rest of my life. It was the price of my ambition, the cost of my revenge, and it was a price I would pay, forever and always.